Fishing in video games. I'm sure these words alone evoke some memories to you. Maybe you're the type to live vicariously to life sims like Harvest Moon, or maybe you prefer filling out your museum in Animal Crossing. Two titles that have gameplay elements dedicated to fishing, but never go out of their way to make it their main appeal. Fishing tends to be relegated to minigames, smaller portions of a bigger product. It's an extremely common trope in video games. I guess if you want to get technical, there are games that make fishing their primary objective, but those extremely niche simulators are played almost exclusively by middle-aged dads. Here, I'm mostly talking about games that have fishing mechanics or even side game modes wedged in between their main segments. Stuff like Yakuza, Dark Cloud, Final Fantasy. So many games use fishing as a side activity that practically every genre has its own variation. Since there's so many options, it feels like there's no wrong way to introduce a system like that. Practically every MMO has fisher as some form of profession. Digimon World has special encounters only found through fishing. Games can get pretty creative with it too. Okami requires you to draw the line on a fishing rod before you're able to cast it. Some games have mandatory section where you'll have to fish in order to advance the plot, while others will leave it entirely to your discretion. But the gist of it is, I really like fishing. It feels relaxing to have this sort of safe haven in between major events, to be able to sit back and relax, maybe score yourself some extra money or items. And even though I've spent this much time driving the point home, there's a very obvious example I've yet to mention, and that's because as a kid, it kinda spooked me. Despite being relatively afraid of water in video games, I've never really had an issue with fishing. Most of the time, it takes place on the edge of a river or a pond, and this game is no different. The Legend of Zelda isn't exactly a stranger to the sport. Most entries after Link's Awakening had some form of fishing minigame included. And while it would make sense for me to talk about Majora's Mask 3D and its revamped fishing, it's actually Ocarina of Time's pond that unnerved me. I know what you're thinking, this place isn't scary whatsoever, but just hear me out, I promise I'm not crazy. The transition from Lake Hylia, this very big open area, to this small fishing pond always made me feel weird. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's something about the neatly aligned rows of trees that almost felt like they were closing in on me. The game was obviously a product of the 90s, and stuff like textured walls surrounding a zone was normal for that era. But to me, it kinda instilled that weird uncanny feeling because unlike other places in Zelda, here it felt more apparent. I felt like I was stuck in a box within a box. In retrospect, it does sound kinda crazy. But anyway, this is pretty much the only area in Ocarina of Time that unintentionally gave me this weird vibe. There's plenty of actual scary places in that game, but for some reason, I was just fixated on that one. I never really managed to find another game that exuded that same feeling of anxiety, of being enclosed in a small area despite being completely safe in it, at least not until recently. On the surface, Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia looks like a pretty cute fishing game. The trailer has this very charming claymation aesthetic spiced with gameplay vignettes showcasing fishing, cooking, and a general look of the lake. I'm a pretty big fan of Bryce Bucher's previous works like Fatum Batula and their contribution to the haunted PS1 community, so I was really excited to play this one. Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia opens up with a few intro screens, the developer's logo, an option to adjust the brightness, and a few content warnings. See, I didn't tell you some of my most embarrassing video game memories for nothing. And while those might seem like a cause for concern, I assure you the game doesn't just throw jump scares your way. It's more of a slow burn experience focused on the ambiance itself. But as much as I want to talk about it right away, let's focus on the gameplay first. After a quick loading screen, you're dropped in the middle of a campsite surrounding the titular Lake Ophelia. Here, you're free to explore and fish to your heart's content. The game supports and recommends the use of a controller, so I went with a DualShock. Even though I tend to prefer mouse and keyboard, the controls felt very intuitive on a controller. The button placement is comfortable, and I appreciate small touches like both triggers being dedicated to the actions you'll perform the most. Left trigger is for running, while the right one is for casting and reeling back your line. There's also a button to pull back your line instantly in case you miss where you were aiming or you want to back out quickly. Even though the basic controls were ideal for me, there is an option available if you want to rebind them, so that's pretty neat. Gameplay-wise, you'll be doing a lot of fishing. At first, I mistakenly thought the fishing mechanic was a bit too simple for my taste since I was catching smaller fish in just a few seconds, but it became a lot more mechanically involved the further I played. It's a lot of what you'd expect. Gotta attract the fish by wiggling your lure a bit, pull back your line but not too quickly, otherwise it's gonna snap. Whenever you feel like you've fished enough, you can return to the campsite to sell your stuff. The first time I met the salesman there, my heart kinda dropped. I remembered you could sleep in your tent at night, so whenever it started getting dark, I made my way back to the campsite. I definitely didn't expect to see my campfire already lit with a dark silhouette behind it. Despite his opening lines of dialogue, the salesman's completely harmless. Not only will he buy your fish, but he also acts as your way of progressing through the game. The shop offers additional items that act as upgrades to your gear. There's fishing rods that allow you to throw your line further, and there's lures that increase how deep you can fish. Each lure has a different depth and attraction level, so even though you can get the deepest one, it doesn't mean it's the most effective. If you're not in the mood to sell your fish, there's also a small hut nearby where you can cook them instead. 4 of any type of fish can create a luck-enhancing dish with various degrees of success. I learned pretty fast that only the expensive one made the good meals. Not that it's exactly necessary though. I ended up catching most of the rare spawns without eating prior. The last 2 fish I needed weren't exactly rare, they were just tucked away in a more secretive area of the lake. The core gameplay loop of selling your fish until you have enough money to afford the next upgrade can sound a bit boring on paper, but trust me, it gets addictive very fast. I came in with the expectation that it would be a cool experience to play for a bit and then I'd move on, but I ended up getting sucked in for hours of unbridled fishing frenzy. Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia is very good at making you feel like you're progressing, like you're accomplishing something no matter how small it is. I constantly felt like I had a goal to work towards and the amount of money required for buying items never felt ludicrous. Despite the game revolving entirely around fishing, it never felt grindy or tedious. From a technical standpoint, I'm sure someone could argue that the game can get a bit repetitive. After all, you're kinda just fishing at different spots around the lake, but I personally felt like the art direction, the variety of catchable specimens, on top of the side objectives added a lot to the experience. Something that definitely kept my interest is how our protagonist interacts with the world. They have adorable little snippets of dialogue every time they catch a fish, on top of cataloging each of them in their Fishpedia. It's this book in your inventory and it serves to categorize which of the 32 available species you've caught, as well as sharing some general info about them. I found it very charming and I practically stopped every time I caught something new just to read up on it. While I'm sure this could have been expanded in a more professional way, like an actual encyclopedia, I really enjoyed the almost childish scrapbook nature the Fishpedia has. It really felt like it was just some kid writing their immediate thoughts about their catch of the day. I guess that might be why I went out of my way to collect all of them. A big part of my playtime was spent delaying the ending over and over because I was missing a fish or two. I could have technically just bought the best items available as soon as possible and moved on to see the ending, but there was something weirdly addictive about looking out for different shapes in the water. This one's color looks a bit different, maybe it's the one I'm missing. Every time I'd spot a new fish, I'd be on the edge of my seat, overly careful about where my lure lands or if I'm reeling in too fast. I probably sound like one of those boomer memes, but there's legit no better feeling than finally catching that one fish that's been eluding you for half an hour. Even though the completionist aspect was entirely optional, I felt like the extra time I spent completing the Fishpedia was worth it. The game's length will vary depending on luck and how you play, but for me, it took just a little under 4 hours and that's full completionist mode. This ties nicely into another feature I absolutely loved about the game. On top of the different types of fish, there's also 5 secret lures spread across the entire playable area. I managed to snag the first 2 naturally by just stumbling upon them as I played, but the last 3 were hidden really well. Also, I love how they're all references to indie games. Just like the store-bought lures, each of them have stats with depths and attraction levels respectively, but I gotta say, the unnamed deserves a lot better than 1 for attraction. They could use a break after the events of an outcry. Even though it was also completely optional, looking for those all over the place was so much fun. At first, the optional lures seemed mostly decorative since their stats are fairly lower than the store-bought ones, but I ended up using the Morning Stone a lot more than I expected. For the longest time, it was the only lure I had that could go pretty deep. While we're on the topic of depth, I love how the music fades when your lure's underwater. It's such a small touch that seems so obvious, but it adds a lot to the experience. Sound design is unfortunately one of my greatest weaknesses when it comes to reviews. While I clearly understand the importance of a good OST for pretty much any form of media, my lack of experience in that field tends to leave me with very little to say, which is kind of a shame when it comes to games like this. The OST for Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia felt unintrusive. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just a couple of guitar chords and some wind chimes here and there. Most of the time, you won't even notice it. The music fades in and out as you play, and that leaves you with the birds chirping in the distance, the sound of your line tensing up as you reel in a fish. And while at first I found it pretty minimal, I don't think I would have liked the game as much if the sound design was any different. You're not exactly fighting 10 feet tall monsters here, you're just some kid in a forest fishing up all day. The soundtrack never outstayed its welcome and at some point almost felt soothing. Every time the music would slowly kick back in, I noticed. Simone Pelletier, the extremely talented artist behind this game's OST, was also the one who did the Fatum Betula soundtrack, as well as the theme for the Haunted PS1 Demo Disc Museum, so it's safe to say their work left quite an impact on me. They made me reconsider the way I interact with music entirely, and that's not something I get to say often. But of course I kept my favorite for last. While I now have a huge appreciation for the gameplay and its intricacies, it's definitely the game's art direction that grabbed my attention. It's kinda hard for me to put in words how much charm this game has. The trailer's claymation segments, every fish model, the lures, even the character design, it all looks so cool. The protagonist specifically, I love controlling a character that has big shonen protagonist energy with that oversized hoodie and those shorts, I just love them. One of the small details I love so much about this game is how the inventory's background will change depending on the time of the day. You can clearly see there's a lot of passion poured in this. But nothing truly compares to what is probably my favorite element from Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia, the world itself. With the way progression works in this game, the lake feels divided by levels. You start with the shallow region, then slowly progress to the deeper ones as you buy better equipment. Even though Lake Ophelia can't compare in size to any open world game, it still felt pretty big to me. I love how you can start fishing practically anywhere. The most obvious spot is probably the little pond next to your campsite. There's all sorts of small catch for you to practice on. And when you're ready to move on, there's the northeast corner of the lake with its reeds and slightly bigger fish. The cave near the waterfall is also a good spot, not just because of its selection of weirder fish, but also because the lighting there is beautiful at night. Hearing the waterfall just out of sight while I fished there was really relaxing. Whenever you start getting better equipment, the descent towards the lower levels gradually introduce bigger options that are worth a lot more. I spoke about it a bit earlier, but I love how the game naturally progresses you through those. Obviously, bigger fish means more money to spend on lures, but also, the way the game works, being able to reach the deeper part feels like you're unlocking an entire sub-region of the map. I remember the first time I caught a bass or a tuna, and way below them, there was this marlin just swimming around, just ever so slightly out of reach. It motivated me even more to get the next upgrade so I could go see what other species was hiding over there. Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia made me want to discover everything the map had to offer, but as much as I loved the game's setting, I had this strange feeling about it. Knowing Bryce's previous projects, I had a feeling that something spooky would be hiding somewhere. To be completely honest, there's nothing outright scary waiting for you besides the occasional deep-sea fish, but still, something felt off about the lake. When I first started playing, nothing looked out of the ordinary. The sun was shining, birds chirping, and plenty of fish waiting for me to catch them. But the further I played, the more I found myself thinking of that familiar feeling again, as if the eerie line of trees surrounding the lake was closing in on me. In Ocarina of Time, you could at least see the ground below the pond, and pretty much stand on it. Lake Ophelia though, it got deep very fast. Granted, there's no swimming mechanics so I don't have to worry about drowning, but still. The game's full of moments that will make you wonder, am I really safe here? It's never pointed out besides maybe once or twice with the salesman talking about rumors of missing kids and eyes in the darkness, but there's always this strange feeling, like someone's hiding behind those trees, silently watching your every move. I hesitate to call the lake a liminal space, since that term's been used to describe a broad amount of things, but there's something weird going on here for sure. To be completely honest, even though the atmosphere felt a bit spooky, Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia is far from being a horror game. You're not being chased around by some killer or anything. As a matter of fact, I practically forgot about my anxiety entirely when I started filling out the Fishpedia. I was so focused on getting every last fish that the tension dissipated a lot, at least until I stared directly into the abyss. During your playthrough, you might notice a strange shape deep underwater. This is where the mystery in the title comes into play. Resting at the bottom of the lake is a pretty sizable crack leading to God knows where. At first, I didn't think much of it when I was still fishing in the shallows, but the deeper I got, the more I felt its presence creeping up on me. Part of me already felt like I wasn't meant to be here. I didn't exactly need this giant gaping abyss to tell me that. I can't even begin to describe how terrifying it felt trying to snag a manta ray right above it. I think they did an amazing job at bringing back the anxiety that melted away over the course of my playthrough. The entire time I was fishing, I kept thinking to myself, what could possibly be under there? While I'd love to reveal what's there instantly, this section of the video would benefit greatly from a spoiler warning. If what I've talked about so far interests you, I can't recommend Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia enough. Nothing can replace the feeling of playing through it by yourself, at night, preferably with as little lights as possible. But enough waiting. If you're still here, you've been warned. Those content warnings at the start weren't there for nothing. Once I felt confident I didn't have anything else to do, I bought the last lure and rod available from the store. Sometimes at night, you might see this strange glow on the surface of the lake. This light seems to be emanating from whatever's under the crack at the bottom. This is the condition needed to reach the game's ending. You could technically reach whatever's under the crack at any time, but it's only when it's glowing that you can see the ending. So I threw my lure in and let it slowly sink into the crevice, only to be met with pitch black darkness. You can probably already guess that I'm not exactly the most comfortable person when it comes to exploring underwater depth, but there was something extra terrifying about my lure just going on and on and on, even passing by a transmission tower at some point. If you missed out on the content warnings earlier, trypophobia and flashing lights warning for the next 50 seconds, a minute roughly. You eventually hear a loud rumbling and your character is transported to an entire separate zone. I don't know where we are, but the very Lovecraftian nature of the ending made my stomach churn a bit. Your character is slowly dragged into the darkness, and whenever they're completely disappeared, this scene plays out. After that, the credits play out and you're booted back to the game's intro. A bit of an abrupt end, but I liked it. You can then safely return to the game as if nothing horrifying ever happened. Your progress is even saved, that way if you're missing a couple of things, you don't have to restart the game all over. As much as I made a big deal about my initial feelings of anxiety towards Lake Ophelia's atmosphere, I don't think I could have predicted how much fun I had. It was both eerie and enjoyable to just figure it out as I went through the game. So if what I talked about interests you, please go play it by yourself. It's pretty cheap and is available both on Steam and itch.io, and if you have the chance, make sure to check Bryce's other works. In the end, Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia reminded me of something important. As a kid, I used to have this terrible habit of overanalyzing stuff I played. Even nowadays I catch myself doing it sometimes. Back then, I failed to realize that a game's worth wasn't exclusively determined by how it ended. It's about the sum of your feelings towards the experience, everything included. Ever since I started playing indie titles, and God knows that was a while ago, I developed a healthier approach as to how I interact with video games as a medium. So I think it was important for me not to overly discuss or try to dissect the game's overall theme or even its ending. Sometimes it's okay for games to just convey a feeling, a mood, a general idea. Not only do I think Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia did that perfectly, but it's one of those games that's gonna stay on my mind for quite some time now. Hey, welcome to the end of the video. I ran out of creative ways to thank you for making it this far like 2 videos ago, so thank you, see you later.